My name is Bernhard Schölkopf. Very happy to introduce our first speaker. So we'll have 3 speakers in this session. We don't take questions right after the talk or during the talk, but you submit them online and we have a question and discussion session at the end of that short session. First talk will be given by Neil Lawrence, who doesn't need an introduction, but for those outside of the field, Neil Lawrence is one of the most prominent machine learning researchers. He's a professor in the computer lab at Cambridge University. He's also quite a prominent public figure in machine learning, quite active in various respects, and currently heavily engaged in the DELV initiative at the Royal Society. And I think he'll tell us something about that in the next 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Over to you.
So thanks very much, first of all, to ELLIS for this invite and also for organizing this seminar series. I'm about to show you what I've been busy doing over the last few weeks, and I've joined ELLIS seminars when I can, but I know how helpful they've been across a wide range of people in this epidemic. It's a really good way of connecting and seeing the latest research. So the DELV initiative is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And the DELV initiative is a rapidly convened group by the Royal Society. This is what it stands for: Data, Evaluation and Learning for Viral Epidemics. I should say it might have been borrowed from a piece of work at the University of Toronto back in the 1990s, for those that remember. I was trying to think of a good name for the initiative because we were wondering about names, and they had such this great name, DELV, and it may have been reused a little bit there. So there's some machine learning history to our name. But I think the reason the name is so appropriate is because the initiative is really not necessarily trying to do new science. It does new science where appropriate, but it's much more about trying to look at the existing science and give the best understanding possible to UK government in terms of policy. So I don't know how many people know about how scientific advice is absorbed by UK government, but there's a group called SAGE, which is Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And the idea with DELV is that what we wanted to do was feed into that with techniques that were taken from data science and machine learning techniques, expanding to some modeling. So the SAGE group's main input is something called the SPIM, which is a Scientific Pandemics Influenza, it stands for, modeling group. And that tends to be more mathematical biologists on the epidemiological side. So what DELV was initially looking to do was also provide a route for data science and also learnings from international situations to also feed into policy advice. Now, in the end, there's a few ways that I think it's differed. If you've done science in practice, you'll immediately follow what these ways are. It's actually very difficult to do data science and machine learning for deployed questions without really good domain expertise. And so the idea that you can just have people who understand data but don't understand domain answering questions is clearly not workable, and we understand that well. So actually, this initial remit has led to just a very multidisciplinary team, because once you sort of say, well, what are the things we're going to have to understand, you realize you need to cover all these different areas. So virology, immunology, epidemiology, economics, we've got behavioral scientists, all formed within the group. So the project has a particular structure which comes from the Royal Society is used to convening groups of scientists, but normally these groups of scientists will be reporting sort of over 2-year periods. There's actually, I was reading a bit about the history, there's a fascinating history with the Royal Society. It's founded in 1660, and sort of Newton's, I think, the second or third president. But at one point, the Royal Society, the president of the Royal Society was the sort of government's chief scientific advisor. That's no longer the case. It's an independent society. And there are separate groups of government advisors, chief scientific advisors, who actually convene in the SAGE committee. But the Royal Society now does a lot of projects, some of which you may have seen. There was a machine learning project that was produced a few years ago, I think it's about 3 or 4 years ago. And those projects are providing general background to policy advice. So this is a slightly different thing for the Royal Society, because policy questions, for those of you who've been working closely with government, they're often asking questions which they'd like answers to, perhaps on the basis of a time frame of a week. In particular, they convene SAGE meetings to answer particular questions, and you may only know what those questions are going to be a week in advance. Now, that makes it very difficult. So one of the things we're doing in a normal Royal Society initiative is you end up with something like a steering committee. And this is, in our case, the steering committee has people like Venki Ramakrishnan on it, who's the president of the Royal Society. It sort of has knights and lords and Nobel Prize winners and that sort of thing, but a really diverse group. So they're just they're technically very, very strong, but really great for networking. Our working group is what myself and Ui Tay were tasked with initially forming before we appointed a chair. And actually, again, it's quite high-powered scientists, statisticians as well, coming together to help feed our advice. The thing that I think UI and I were nervous about, so UI and I did the initial pulling of things together, is that actually we had to get data science done on the ground. So we invented the notion of what we're calling the action team. So the action team, the people in the group who are actually pulling the data together, they're also reading the papers, summarizing the papers, and bringing that information into one place. It's quite hard to sort of get communication going rapidly across all such groups, particularly when you're trying to turn around things in a week. So the steering committee is meeting once a week, the working group's meeting once a week. The action team, we have action team updates that occur 3 times a week, but we're not sort of forcing everyone to turn up to every one. And the main activities really are occurring on Slack. And it's a diverse group of people from domains, different universities, who haven't known each other before this meeting. So actually bringing them together in relationships of trust has been really important. Now, getting communication going well through this is also really important. So you've got to make sure that the steering committee trusts the work that the action team is doing. The typical dislocation you get in a scientific scenario, and you see this again and again in academia, academics, we all have opinions. We all have what we think people should be doing. And we're not actually that timid about sharing our opinions. We're perhaps sometimes reluctant to go ahead and do those things. Which is an interesting difference. I spent 3 years in industry. In industry, you don't normally say that stuff should be done unless you're willing to pick it up and do it yourself. Academics, we don't quite have those constraints. So what you want to make sure is that the action team that's doing the work has a really good, strong relationship with the steering committee and the working group. And the way we did that is the members of the action team are mainly nominated by the steering committee and the working group of people that they know who can deliver, who understand data and can deliver on answering questions and ego-free and will work well in a larger group. And that's been really, really important. I'd say one difference I've seen in the DELVE initiative versus other initiatives, I think the natural instinct whenever you're launching an initiative in this space is to do what academics always do, which is to have a very large call for proposals for people who can help. That's great, we love that, but it doesn't really make it easy to form teams that are multidisciplinary and agile and can deploy on new questions very rapidly, because as soon as you've had an open call to do something, you have all these obligations around fairness of who's included and who isn't. Now, the DELVE initiative is not giving anyone any funding. So in that sense, it's much more about who do we know who could help deliver a job and has some time on their hands, which is quite different from the normal approach. And that's driven by the very short time frame. So anyone on this call who has the right expertise, we're very happy to integrate when the relevant question comes up. We're not sort of limiting the scope of those we include. The other aspect of the DELVE initiative that I think is quite important is what we call the supply chain of ideas. So it's very apparent in the epidemic that there's no shortage of people who think they have solutions. to the problems that we're facing. The challenge is that the people who are in power and capable of delivering on those solutions are relatively few, and they're very, very busy. So there's something you tend to see quite a lot is, well, I don't understand why they don't just do this, where this is some solution. Well, the chances are that the person who's trying to make the decision may not even know about that solution because it's associated with a particular expertise. So with the Delve Action Team, we've really tried to focus on what we call the supply chain of ideas, which is we're not so much trying to generate new ideas ourselves. Sometimes we have to, where there's a gap in the knowledge or something that a model that needs creating or a data analysis that needs doing to answer a particular question. But mainly what we're trying to do is control the mapping of these ideas to the policy questions. So the policy questions are coming from government, civil service. They're also coming, we also raise our own policy questions within the group and from the steering committee and the working group. And the ideas are out there in the wider community. They're in this network. You know, the people here have amazing ideas, great solutions. They're in other countries. And what we're mainly trying to do is deal with this bottleneck, which is that the mapping of the ideas onto the right solutions is the under-resourced area. Everyone likes to think that they're working on something that will solve things. There are fewer people who have the scientific capability to understand what the right solution is for a particular problem. And I think that this for me is extremely important because it's where things are missing. It's a difficult job, but it's not a job that many of us are trained to do. So I think there's this constant feeling of being slightly uncomfortable that you're often having to stretch outside your usual domain of expertise. And to deal with that, we've really tried to make sure we bring together a group that's very open about their ignorance. So we stipulate when people join, you should be prepared to ask, in inverted commas, stupid questions. Very few of these questions are stupid, and you should be prepared to answer, in inverted commas, stupid questions. And of course, the result is that people start to find out things about other domains that they were afraid to ask, or people start questioning the assumptions in their own domain, because some of these, in inverted commas, stupid questions are very on point and pointing out, say, a major weakness in a particular way of thinking that isn't normally identified because we tend to silo within our scientific areas. So personally, I've really enjoyed watching that process and being involved where I am. So as I say, highly multidisciplinary, immunologists, virologists. The immunologists in particular, I think even amongst biologists, they're known for their sort of arcane terms and languages, and they're very lovely. You know, these are sort of world famous immunologists in the steering committee, but they're very open to explaining what they're doing. The virologists, the same. And one of the things that kind of really shocked me early on was the speed at which, when you got the immunologists together, that they were saying, well, coronaviruses don't typically have, you know, lifetime immunity associated with them. It tends to be typically, well, figures they were sort of mentioning, and I don't know, we don't know what it is for COVID obviously yet, is sort of 18 months. And I just never heard that in the broader scientific conversation from the epidemiologists. All these things about herd immunity. We're not saying that the existing coronaviruses that are in the population tend to have this restricted immunity. And I think part of the reason is because people just weren't integrating the immunologists in their discussions. The other thing is having economists involved is super interesting, particularly when you start getting into domains like test, trace, isolate. There's a large number of things that are just impractical to do, and economists are really used to giving government advice, and they're used to understanding how you have to incentivize people and what things people won't do, and what the techniques are for getting, say, industries to adopt things. They are also, I think, amongst the most professional group, I would say, alongside statisticians, sharing their expertise within a wider group of scientists. I think because they're so used to doing it. Just my observation when you get these multidisciplinary meetings together, the economists always say something useful, you know, even if it's off their domain, and similar to the statisticians. Behavioral scientists as well. So the other aspect I've mentioned is, yeah, the avatar model, that the way we run our action team is we try and make sure that the person's doing the work is basically very closely trusted by someone on the steering committee or the working group and can represent their opinions well. So we're not having to constantly recommunicate with the sort of world famous scientists that are on the steering committee and the working group. We have channels of communication that are closer to the relationship between a PhD supervisor and a student. These aren't always PhD students. These are sometimes full professors, sometimes associate professors. And in fact, I love the diversity of our action team. It goes all the way from PhD students to full professors, just working on a very equal basis together. And the other characteristic that's in there is we do not reinvent the wheel. That's broadly it. I wasn't sure how fast I was going to go through things, so I'll just end briefly with some stuff on, these are some of the tools we use, what we've been working on so far. Yeah, I should say the software tools are extremely important. So we're using Trello and Slack to bring the team together, almost like a virtual institute, to ensure that we're managing to communicate with each other. And that's a massive advantage of this epidemic, is that everyone's in the same position. So we don't have those background conversations going on inside physical institutes that some of us are not party to. We're all party to the same conversations because everything's occurring on Slack. The work so far, what we've done is there's a public report on masks, which recommended that the UK government should be promoting masks as part of that solution. That's a recommendation accepted. Our test, trace, isolate report was given in last week, and it will be published on our website next week. There are several other reports on schools opening, immunology, overview of the immunology of the virus, sector opening, which sectors should be open first in terms of not propagating the disease, but maximizing the economic benefit, and better understanding the effects of social deprivation and lockdown. These reports are in process. Some of them we don't even have great scientific evidence for at the moment. Like I think on schools, it's very difficult to say what the effect is one way or another of opening schools at the moment. And immunology is still not that well understood, but we have ongoing projects on those things. And saving questions for afterwards, so I'll just stop there.